Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today live for our ninth episode of Talk Data to Me. Today is a special edition topic, which we've titled Too Many Fish in the Sea, where we'll be sharing information with you from the latest edition of our Global State of Mobile Phishing report, which was recently published. Did you catch the pun there? My name is Tyler Croak, Principal Strategist here at Lookout, and I'll be the host of today's show. I'm grateful to be joined today by Hank Schless, our Director of Global Security Campaigns. Welcome, Hank, for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely, Tyler. Always great and glad to throw in a dad joke at the start there. It's appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Keeps everyone on their toes.
As I mentioned, for our topic today, we'll be primarily focusing on content from the Global State of Mobile Phishing that we published. And we've thrown in some fun topics, controversial maybe, that we've thrown in for the end of the conversation today. You know, mobile phishing is arguably one of the most effective ways for attackers to steal employee login credentials. You know, we've continued to see steady growth in mobile phishing attempts over the last several years. Once an attacker is stealing those legitimate usernames and passwords, they'll either sell that access to access brokers or they'll use the credentials to really access your own corporate infrastructure. And then the attackers will move laterally with the goal often being, hey, let's find the most sensitive data within the organization and let's exfiltrate it. Remote work and a reliance on bring your own devices has really caused these attacks to grow at an alarming rate. Today, more users are falling victim than ever before, which really exposes data to risk. And based on an analysis of 210 million devices and over 175 million apps, Lookouts found that over 30% of personal and enterprise mobile users encountered a phishing attack in 2022. That's a pretty alarming number. So to kick the topic off, a little bit more deeper dive, Hank, can you give me a little bit more background on the report itself and how do we come up with this data and these statistics?
Yeah, it's a good place to start, Tyler. Of course, it's always good to know where the data comes from. And as you mentioned, obviously it's an analysis of this global data set that we have. Lookout being originally the first mobile security product to market, actually over a decade ago, has given us granted us the luxury of being able to ingest so much telemetry data over the years. And in addition to those devices and apps that you mentioned, we're also ingesting about 4 million URLs, domains, certificates, all sorts of web items into that data set on a consistent basis as well. So it really, when you think about it, phishing is really a significant part of that whole spectrum of mobile risk. And with all that data, we can really offer pretty unique insight at an unmatched scale, really, across obviously phishing, but then application threats, network threats on mobile devices, and then device level threats as well. And that 30% number that you mentioned is really indicative of basically the percentage of devices that are protected by Lookout that encountered at least one mobile phishing link every quarter of 2022, right? So you could even sort of extrapolate that out and say, 30% of mobile users encountered at least 4 phishing links, in 2022, if it was, at least once a quarter. In the report itself, we dive into something that's kind of interesting, looking at the percentage of individuals devices, however you want to say it, people who basically clicked on or tapped on 0 links, and then we have it 1 link, 2 to 5 links, and then 6+. So we kind of break it down to help you understand kind of the growth in each of those. But yeah, so it's, this is obviously one kind of high level number from the report, but we dive into it a little bit more within the report as well, obviously.
Awesome. Let's move on to a slightly different question. Mobile phishing, so it's becoming more pressing. Let's talk a little bit more about what the business impact is for mobile phishing in particular, right?
Totally. And I know you have some thoughts on this, so I'll definitely throw it back to you in a sec.
Sounds good.
But to kind of go over what we talked about in the report, and again, in the report, we kind of get a little more detailed about this. Basically, we combined our own data with data from other sources, such as the Poneman Institute, and then the National Council of Identity Threat Protection. and basically put it into what's known as a FAIR model. So FAIR is the Financial Analysis of Information Risk. And it's a pretty widely used model throughout the industry because it helps assign a potential financial impact to cybersecurity threats, which is it's sometimes a little bit tough to really, to really assign a dollar amount. So this has been recognized as kind of the most credible way to do that. So in the example in our report, we basically used, we said, okay, we've got an organization of 5,000 employees. We combined our data. In this case, this is with the National Council of Identity Threat Protection. And basically it showed that 20% of people will actually, the stat up here, will actually open a phishing message. And then 2/3 of them will actually go and enter their credentials. So that basically results in a 13.4% number that we call the threat capability. And that's part of the FAIR model as well. And basically what that is it's the likelihood of the attack to reach the target if there's zero protection in place, right? So basically it's saying in a 5,000 employee organization, there's a 13.4% chance that a phishing attack, at least, phishing attack will reach, individuals, and then you kind of multiply that out, right? So using that example of 5,000 employees, basically said, okay, because of the number of average phishing attacks that we see per device, and I think it was 3.2 or something, and then times 13.4 gave us 2,500 potential phishing attacks annually on that organization. Now multiplying that with data from the Poneman Institute, which gives an average impact in dollars per event of about, it was right about $1,500. The resulting number was right about $4 million of potential annual impact from mobile phishing. And obviously this is just with the caveat, this is if you have zero protection in place, but even limited protection, right? Even if you have quote unquote, 90% coverage, right? That leaves you exposed to 10% of that. 400 grand is not an insignificant number. So it's just, and as you you can scale that based on, organizations with more kind of sensitive data, what their risk tolerance is. I've talked to people who've said, well, we use the FAIR model and we get our numbers and we basically say, what is the dollar amount of risk tolerance we are willing to take on, right? Because you have to have some, and then that's kind of how we help budget and justify costs for things and all that. So it's an interesting way to look at it. And like I mentioned, Tyler, I know you had some thoughts, so maybe you have something to add here too.
Yeah, well, first off, I think one of the biggest observations there, right, is really thinking about how people are at risk, and people are still a big factor of risk within an organization, right? So you look at all the security technology that's out there, all the products and offerings and whatnot, and as long as an attacker can still successfully exploit humans and people, they're going to, right? It's opportunistic. But besides the financial risk, which I think you covered really well, I'd like to touch base on two other areas that will impact the business, when a mobile phishing attack is successful. I think we have to talk about the reputational damage component, right? And the potential loss of intellectual property. So, in many cases, when these credentials are sold via those access brokers, or they're immediately leveraged by attackers that are trying to gain access to an organization, if and when that attacker is successful and infiltrates the organization and exfiltrates data, the organization has to respond to an incident and communicate with those customers. And there's a lot of scrutiny that's placed on how well that organization responds publicly to incidents. I think we see this in many cases in the news, right? But it's really important on how they do that. And typically after these attacks, you even see, hundreds of security jobs that are posted for that specific company that has been breached. So also, the intellectual property or any sort of trade secrets that might be stolen, again, the attackers are focusing on sensitive data to exfiltrate, right? So this can impact the organization's maybe competitive differentiation that they may have in the market. And it could even impact the company's ability to remain operating, right? The short-term impact, the reputational damage can even impact the stock price of that organization for a period of time. So, really the impact can be huge.
Go ahead.
That's all I was going to add.
Well, one thing I was going to add to that is it's sort of it's interesting. You kind of focus on like the trade secrets, the intellectual property, because it kind of shows the bridge between, right, like you can get phished, like let's say you get phished on a mobile device, right? And we're going to get more into kind of examples and all that in a sec here, but like you get phished on a mobile device, it's not like the attacker is going to pull out his phone and say, all right, I'm going to go log into Google or AWS or whatever on my phone. Like they're going to take those credentials and go to their computer. And then they're accessing it from a desktop, from a laptop. And that's sort of, so it sort of shows the bridge between where kind of the mobile and the cloud security piece kind of really do actually complement each other.
Bridge together. Exactly. It's the whole lateral movement component that you're talking about. Yep.
Totally.
So let's talk a little bit. We mentioned it a bit, but let's focus in even more specifically on how are both user behaviors and attacker methods really evolving then, right? What are we observing?
Yeah, so this was a really interesting one to dive into in the report because even since we put out the first version of the report, I guess it was 2 years ago now, things have changed pretty significantly. And for one thing, I think everyone can agree that these attacks are getting way more convincing. The level of social engineering that can take place at a mass scale is just increased so much over the last few years and across all platforms, right? Especially on mobile, where it's harder to kind of verify or look for that, some of those red flags we know to look for on a computer screen, right? There's no longer the Nigerian prince scam and all that with poorly written,
right.
Language and, just also it's what, everyone kind of figured that one out. Right. So, I think that this comes, with a couple things, alongside. The first is that I think a lot of this is enabled by growth in the malware as a service market. Essentially, this has created a business place and a model for groups or individuals who build these phishing kits to sell everything someone could need to steal credentials for pretty much any SaaS or cloud app. And there's an example we have in the report where it's like I think it's like $275 US. And it gives the person basically a fully skinned, fully built out phishing kit for, I think it was close to 100 cloud services and all these ones that companies everywhere use. Right. So that's one big thing. Also, we'll talk about this in a few minutes with the social engineering piece. ChatGPT definitely doesn't help. That's kind of our spoiler alert. That's sort of our controversial topic. We're going to bring up in a few minutes here. From the user perspective, I would say that the not just growth, but kind of the explosion of BYOD has really played into this. Organizations had to accept the fact that, especially with hybrid work, people are going to use personal devices to access sensitive corporate data. And just as your company's IT or security team knows it, so do the bad guys, right? So they may leverage more personal channels to try to bypass some of the, maybe some of the things that you have in place on the enterprise side. And what's also interesting is that we're seeing, sort of in that sense, we're seeing a really big jump in what are known as hybrid phishing attacks. So these are basically a combination of various techniques. Usually it's, your traditional email phishing, smishing, SMS phishing, vishing, voice phishing, or my favorite one, quishing. It's a fun word to say. So this is, and usually there's a combination of each of these vectors to be able to do things like bypass multi-factor authentication or MFA. And this was actually how Uber was initially breached last year. The attacker basically got an employee's login credentials and then fired the MFA notification so many times that when the attacker contacted the target, pretending to be IT and said, hey, we see this error, just accept allow the login and
click OK,
exactly. Yeah. And everything will be okay. And so obviously that person was pretty easily convinced because they wanted to stop, their phone was, buzzing like crazy or whatever. So in the report, we talked about this, but KnowBe4, which is a great, organization focused on phishing. They noted that these types of hybrid phishing attacks, and it's that again, have did jump more than 7 times in the second quarter of 2022. So lots going on there. Tyler, I don't know if you have anything to add to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you've already touched on really like how the methods are evolving, right? It's still heavy emphasis on basically social engineering and again really exploiting people, right, in new ways, new novel ways. The whole what you mentioned there about like people impersonating IT teams, especially for like large organizations, that might be very effective, right? Because the IT organization may be huge and not everybody that works in the organization knows everybody on the IT team. So it's easy to
Hmm.
kind of like pretend that you're an employee and then
Right.
convince someone else to hit, it's okay to hit yes to the MFA. And then guess what? Your MFA codes are stolen. But in addition to what you mentioned, Hank, I think end users, though, like the people really, the employees, right, that are interacting with these products that provide MFA, they're still seeking a better balance between security and convenience. I think that's one of the end user behaviors that I've been tracking. People want security that protects the organization, but is more transparent and integrated in their daily lives. And the way that we've seen that really done is through MFA approvals on your mobile device, right? So you've got this thing and it's asking you for your MFA code. It's in our face, but it's got its own flaws. So in many cases, it's not like continuously measured, and it provides actually a large time window of access to a specific application than what might be necessary, right? So you may have access to that app for 8 hours, for example.
Right.
And while I'd say MFA is great and necessary to have, improvements still need to be made to more align with zero trust principles. And attackers are going to continue to improve on social engineering techniques to exploit people. So I think in some of the more recent reports that I had read, um, we're seeing attackers that are leveraging MFA fatigue. We talked about that a little bit. Like, somebody's just going to keep spamming MFA until eventually you hit yes, and then they're going to steal your MFA code. The voice phishing, which you already mentioned, and SIM swapping. So, attackers will use the form factor of a mobile device to their advantage and make it more difficult for people to gauge whether or not you're actually visiting a illegitimate website and supplying your credentials. It's a lot different than looking at a traditional laptop screen and being able to determine like, hey, is this legitimate or not? Attackers realize that and they're taking advantage of it. So next, I'm going to move on to another question, big one. What are the biggest tips that you have for protecting against these phishing attacks? What areas would you like to dive into, Hank?
So, I think that we could do a whole hour on this.
Yeah.
So we're not going to do that to people because I don't think anyone wants to hear either of us speak for that long. But I think that to kind of simplify it, not to say this is a simple challenge, but to kind of frame it in an approachable way, I think this ties to basically, always evaluating how your security strategy can evolve or adapt, and really to be able to take a dynamic approach to visualizing, detecting, and minimizing data risk, right? Especially data risk that's posed sort of indirectly posed, right? Like a phishing attack may not necessarily be a direct threat to your data, right? But it's oftentimes the first step, one of the first steps in the process, right? So one thing we explore in the report actually is how you can take the lead from government initiatives, which could be a smart move. And it comes, when it comes to protecting the mobile threat vector, I sort of say that if something's important enough, especially in tech, if it's important enough that the federal government is talking about it, right? I mean, people are kind of joking and, kind of making memes and stuff about like, members of the government bringing up these big printout boards of screenshots of things and on the Senate floor when during the Facebook
Right,
stuff,
I remember that.
It was like, all right, these it's a little bit, it makes it feel a little antiquated, but the fact is that like the government mindset is if it's caught up basically to how the private sector is thinking about it, then obviously it's a big deal and you should pay attention to it. And they've been doing a lot around that mobile threat vector. And again, we could go down an entire path talking about TikTok, right? Everything that's been going on there especially in the last couple of weeks, even the last couple of days, with some with the Office of the President basically saying every government device has 30 days to get rid of TikTok. We don't want this on, and then we see it at the state level.
Yep.
You know, DeSantis just did it in Florida. He banned it on state issued devices. A couple of representatives here in Massachusetts are trying to push legislation through to do the same thing. So let's save that for another time, but a lot to think about there. So when it really comes down to it, I mean, I think that, like I mentioned, credential compromise is really the first step in most attacks these days. Attackers want to remain discreet and quiet. They're not going to, they're not going to brute force their way into infrastructure really anymore. And so protecting against that initial compromise is arguably the most important thing you can do. And, you know, we actually saw this with Zendesk. There was an article that came out, I think it was last week or so, basically acknowledging that their breach last year started with an SMS phishing attack. So obviously attackers are targeting these devices and they're getting pretty good at it and doing so with pretty good success.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to add really, first off, you mentioned like the government initiatives. I think more broadly speaking, we're seeing a lot of collaboration between government and private organizations. Like I've been to a bunch of cybersecurity conferences within the last year where we're seeing a lot of that collaboration. And so I think that influence is going to naturally continue and happen. And I think it's a great thing that we're seeing more focus on mobile devices being treated more like a traditional endpoint that needs protection. In addition to that great collaboration that we're seeing, I think that in addition to having security products that provide capabilities to detect and block phishing, the people component that we've talked about is really important. So, improving awareness, making people aware of how phishing is really evolving and protecting against different attack types is important. And continue to report things that seem suspicious to your security team, right? Organizations are going to need to continue creating a culture of security champions at the organization where everyone is really responsible for it. Okay. So I know we've been going on a little long, but let's move on to some more of the fun, controversial topics that we have for today, right? So the first one really is, we talked about this a little bit, but why do you think mobile security doesn't get enough attention in the industry, and why does it really deserve more attention?
Yeah, so having been at Lookout for 4.5 years at this point, I feel pretty passionately about this topic. I joined the company originally because I was at a cloud security company before, and I said, I was like, yes, cloud will be growing, all that, but people are only ever going to be using their phones more. At that point, there was still a lot of people using, having a personal and a work phone. So it was like one of these things where I sat there and I was like, all right, this seems like a place that sort of a sleeping giant, right? And obviously, now that we have the mobile piece plus the secure services edge piece where we're looking at, securing cloud infrastructure and on-premise infrastructure and web activity, it's sort of evolved into this whole well-rounded story. But I think that a big piece of why mobile traditionally doesn't get enough attention is that really just up until a few years ago, mobile devices had some access to corporate data. Realistically, it was, email, definitely. I mean, that's been since, BlackBerries, that's always been something. But, maybe some viewing capabilities and platform, and kind of like Office 365 or Google Drive or more kind of the sharing platforms. But now what I see is that people can move so fluidly between, a laptop or desktop and a smartphone or a tablet that I really believe that you need to be securing every device type with the same level of urgency and scrutiny, because from your side as an administrator, right? I mean, you were on the practitioner side for a while, Tyler, right? From your side in that role, it really, if you're saying, all right, I need to apply a data protection policy or an access policy or whatever it is, right? To all of this, to all of anyone trying to access, my Salesforce instance or something like that. It shouldn't matter what device that's coming from, right? Because it's equally accessible from all of them. So from your side and the admin side, that shouldn't be a challenge. And then from the user side, they shouldn't see a difference between when they try to access something on mobile and when they try to access something on a desktop. And so I think that, they just, you to your point, I think you mentioned earlier, like you want to be able to enable that productivity securely, but, mobile really hasn't been up until the last, probably I don't know, 4 or 5 years, really, hasn't really been, from the enterprise perspective, an equally kind of an equal citizen in that sense.
Yeah, treated equally.
And I also think this is a little bit of an existential thought that I have frequently, but it's like, it's sort of those things where your phones are so personal, right? Everyone, it's like, it's this thing that's in your pocket. It's sitting right here beside me. It is it's one of the many things that is an alarm in the morning, right? It's, so to admit that it's not safe is almost like saying, well, I'm not safe, right? And people don't want to do that, right? We trust these devices with so much information. You put your credit card information, your health data, emergency info, bank info, all of this stuff in this device, and you basically trust it to keep all these things safe. But the reality is that they're just pieces of hardware with software running on them. And as we've seen since the early days of security in the industry, any hardware, any software is vulnerable. So I think that it's just, I think that people are coming around to the recognition that mobile needs to be a part of it. I think people are also coming around to the recognition that, access to cloud data or cloud infrastructure is something that can happen for mobile. So tying it into that strategy as well. And I think it's coming around for sure. But that's sort of I'll get off my soapbox, but that's,
it's really good thoughts. I mean, I'll extend what you're saying and say, that mobile device has really become that additional appendage for us all, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if I was to summarize what you said, it really has become that additional appendage for us all. And how often are we late at night reviewing some work email that may have an attachment to it that has some sensitive data in it? In all reality, right? We're doing that rather than like going in front of our traditional laptop and then opening it up there in many cases, right? So that's why the risk is real and there. I think that it's being more and more acknowledged that it shouldn't just be something we should protect, but that we have to protect it. The OMB initiatives that we mentioned within the report are evidence of that. And I think we'll see more and more breaches and case studies that indicate how mobile devices are leveraged in early stages to gain access to an organization. I think we're seeing more of this evidence today. I read CrowdStrike's recent threat report that showed evidence of specific threat actor groups that had focused on that in 2022. We've seen evidence of that in IBM's X-Force report. So, we as Lookout, we're eager to contribute towards these stories wherever we can and bridge the gap to help raise awareness and the need for mobile security. So one last quick topic. Of course, this is the controversial one. How do you think the ever-evolving landscape of AI, and in particular ChatGPT, could influence how these mobile phishing attempts are done?
Right. Okay. We've got 90 seconds, so I'm going to keep it
really tight. Give me the 30-second one.
Basically, I think that ChatGPT is becoming the deep fake of written text. That's sort of my thesis on this. You can get this tool to sound in your head or look like anyone or anything that you want. And there's some pretty scary possibilities. There's some awesome possibilities for sure. Believe me, it's pretty incredible to see what they can do. But I think that's basically how I think about it, right? People have been talking about deep fakes forever. I think this is basically the deep fake for text. So I don't know if you have thoughts on. I know you were trying to get it to write a phishing message for you. So
What's interesting, right, is we've been able to social engineer the AI to produce phishing emails for us. So at first it throws up the ethical barrier and wall and says no, I can't create this for you. And then if you just keep persisting, you can convince it to create that email for you. So again, there's going to be legitimate needs for it. And it's also going to be used for illegitimate purposes as well. So that's the summary. That was our final topic for today. Thanks, Hank, for being with me on the show. And, as a call to action, be sure to check out the full report that you'll have access to that's been referenced today. And we'll see you in a few weeks for another episode of Talk Data to Me. Our next episode is on International Women's Day. So we'll see you in a few weeks for that special episode. Thanks for your time and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.